Hi, David Vizard here, and you are watching PowerTec 10. I guess this will be the first part of our cylinder head test here, and that's on small block Ford, that is. So that's our primary subject there, but there was a lot of work we had to do to get ready for it. For instance, we had to have a suitable mule motor. Well, Andy of the Andy Wood fame does quite a bit of work for me on the side to help out with my work overload here. And so Andy's building, or rather speccing out, our mule motor short block ready for the cylinder head test. So let me hand you over to Andy. Here we go.
Hi, Andy Wood here. You know, when it comes to porting cylinder heads, there's a lot of videos out there. But what we're going to show you is not only the porting itself, but we're going to give you all of the data that goes along with it. The flow results and the dyno results, but most importantly, knowing that you're going to win races. You know, when it comes to doing these tests, you got to have a good dyno mule. And the reason for that is you got to be able to have repeatability and durability to validate all of your testing. So when it gets to the nitty gritty, let's talk about that. Like these pistons right here, these are moly forged pistons, but guess what? They're not for a Ford, they're for a Chevy. And guess what else? It's got Chevy rods. What does that equal? A strong running engine. So you might be asking yourself, why would you put Chevy rod and piston inside of a Ford? I tell you why. When you want to turn a lot of RPMs, that longer rod is made out of powdered metal, okay? And that's going to give us 8,000 RPM durability. Now these pistons here, they have very skinny rings, 1 millimeter. That is going to give you low friction, so that frees up power. So there's a multitude of things going on here, and there is a science behind this, but it's all going to equal horsepower at the end of the day. You know, when it comes to assembling an engine, you can have all of the good parts, but the one thing that remains constant is the cornerstone for any engine build is having good machine work, okay? And that is priceless. The machine work on this engine was done by Terry Walters up in Roanoke, Virginia, and let me tell you, his program is second to none. Welcome back. So as you see here, we've got a ton of cylinder heads, but this is not all inclusive of the heads that's going to be tested. So let's talk about what we're going to be using as our test subjects. Okay, we come right here. This is an E7 head. This is the cylinder head that came factory on 5.0s from 1987 up. Now this cylinder head has been totally reconditioned. It has upgraded valve springs. The seats have been reconditioned on Goodson cutter. So this represents a good stock cylinder head. All right, moving over here. Two of David's attendees to his class did these cylinder heads. Now this represents what we'd call a machine finished head. It's been ported, but there's been a lot of things done with a machine versus a hand job, okay? Now this is kind of like middle of the road as far as the factory heads is going to go. This one here represents a little bit more exotic on the factory end. Charlie took and put, it's got textured ports, it's got anti-reversion valves, and if you want to learn more about anti-reversion, you really need to check out DV's seminars. But we're going to show you the benefits of that on a factory cylinder head, and I promise you, you will be blown away by how much power that can be made from this stock E7 cylinder head. I know I was. Now over here, let's say you don't have a set of E7s, but you're lucky enough to have some 289 heads. DV's techniques can be applied to these cylinder heads as well. This here has a port design that was done by one of his attendees, Charlie, and it has DV's famous chamber mods done to it. Now this head here is a really close rival to the best E7s, but we'll let the dyno do the talking when it comes to it. Now, last but not least, I saved the best for last, and I'm going to let DV give you the lowdown on what makes these heads so special. So stick around. DV, give them the lowdown.
Okay, here's the lowdown on this. This is my Super Trick Dart modified 170 head. From Dart, they start off at about 165 cc, but by the time I've modified it, they're about 175. Now that doesn't sound much bigger. It isn't. However, I did manage to get the flow up to 300 CFM with a 175 cc port. What I'm going to tell you now probably won't make much sense to most of you, but this port here is as effective as an F1 port for what it is. This I measure by taking the port energy density of the port. This is matching F1 category stuff and Pro Stock. How well did it work? It was dynamite. You want a head like this? You either do it yourself or you pay me $4,000 to do it. That's how much work goes into it. Lastly, we got this trip flow head. I haven't assembled this, it was not time to do that. But this is another one of my favorites here. They're very good for torque and horsepower out of the box, but they port up brilliantly. So we're going to look at that. Now let's look at some of the other more common cylinder heads, and we'll go over to the ones on the other side.
But hang on a second, I want to interact with you a little bit. So DV, give us the lowdown on port energy. Why is it so important that something that you don't see a lot of on the internet? I've never seen port energy mentioned in a video, but why is it so crucial and what does it do?
Port energy is developed from mass airflow and velocity. Mass airflow, i.e. big flow numbers, don't necessarily make horsepower.
That's right.
This is where we get that expression, the flow bench can only tell you so much.
Exactly.
People who stop at the flow numbers are not getting the full benefit of what the flow bench can tell them. Most people, when I say most people, I'm talking about 99.9999 people do not know about port energy density. If I discount those people who came to my class, I could probably count the number of people who are familiar with port energy on one hand. Now then, port energy is important because it's a bit like the ballistic energy of a bullet. That column of air going into the engine can be speeded up and it can ram that cylinder. The result is more horsepower and more torque per cubic inch. The hard deal to get here is torque, right? You only get torque by having your port designed correct and matching the camshaft to it.
Now I can take this and exactly what he said, and I've applied it in my cylinder head and in my life. Now he and I did a 393 cubic inch Windsor for my truck. The port wound up being 192 cc's and it flowed a little over 315 CFM. But the interesting part about it is how many foot-pounds that engine makes. Most people who make a good street strip engine build, they will only get about 1.2 foot-pounds per cube, but we were able to get up around 1.4. That's what separates the men from the boys when it becomes the engine building, because the more foot-pounds that you can get from a streetable compression ratio means that you're going to be in front of the next guy. Is that not right?
Yep, that's exactly so. Anyway, Andy, give the guys the lowdown on that.
All right. Okay, these cylinder heads right here represent the next level up from a factory head. This is actually a Ford racing head. It's an aluminum version of a GT40 head. that was offered as a production item in the mid to late 1990s. This is an aluminum version of that, and this head right here is an improved upon version of the Ford head. This is made by a company, PowerTec. It has 180cc runners, but the main thing about it is the way the runners are shaped. It's a more efficient port, and it's going to deliver more power than even the Ford racing head. Okay, so we've given you a brief rundown of what we're doing here. So next we're going to talk about the flow numbers and the dyno numbers of what the stock E7 heads will produce. Welcome back, everybody. Well, today is a Sunday morning and we decided to come down here and do some work on these flow numbers. So David has come up with a program with Stan Weiss, and it's called the IOP. And it's really eye-opening because it gives a way to measure cylinder head performance. So DV, will you tell everybody about it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andy. IOP is a flow bench program which was written jointly by my good friend Stan Wise and myself. It's unique in as much as it helps the head porter to go to the next step, as it analyzes what's going on with the flow in the cylinder head's ports. Here we have the opening page. We put in the basic details here, like the compression ratio, the engine's bore and stroke, the number of cylinders, etc., etc. And then we go along and we select one of those bars we see along the bottom, which says flow test number 1, number 2, number 3, etc. So let's go and select that. We've already flowed our stuff, so it's preloaded, so we'll go straight to that screen. Basically, we've filled in our data down here that the program calls for and entered our flow figures here and here. By hitting the calculate button over there, we get all these results here. Notice there's a little difference here from most deals, because not only do we get the flow figures, final flow figures here corrected, but we also get the CFM per square inch, the SAE discharge coefficient, the ratio of intake to exhaust that's required, and the existing one, plus the port mean effective pressure. But there's more. However, let's look at what we've got for results. As you can see, well, maybe you can see, even at 700 lift, the stock head with the stock valve seat only flowed a paltry 153 CFM on the intake and 112 on the exhaust. Now let's look at what we did with the seats recut. Again, you may not be able to see this, but we have made some small gains here. Our peak flow went to 162 on the intake and 115 on the exhaust. But it's better if we look at this in graphic form and we compare one cylinder head to the other. So let's do that now. Here's the graph of the two cylinder heads. This thin line here is the original head with the seats as per factory. The new line here, the thick one, is the seats I've just cut. That's a decent 3-angle valve job. It's not easy to see the gains down here, so what we should do is to look at the efficiency of the valves. It will give us a better idea of the low lift gains that we have here. That's our next graph. Now this graph is showing the efficiency with which the valve is passing air. Here is our intake at low lift. This is our lift down here. You'll notice that it reaches almost 66% here. Pretty good. The stock one only was about 63% at best. Right? Exhaust, pretty good as well. In the mid-range here, we had a slight loss of efficiency, but in the main, it picked up. Same with the exhaust. All through the mid-range, not much, but at high lift, it picked up. So our test head is better than stock. So please remember that when we're comparing the modified heads with the baseline heads, is we do have a very good baseline head.
Well, we're going to take a short block and we're going to finally turn it into a long block. But I want to give you a little bit of a tech tip before we get started. These lifters right here, while they're stock Ford units, they have been rebuilt. And that's so that we can put a stiff valve spring on it to prevent lifter pump up, because we are going to be turning some RPMs with this engine. And another side note when it comes to small block Fords is making sure that you put the lifters in the bores before you bolt the cylinder head on, because they will not go in after the fact. The next move is to install these dog bones in the spider. That is to ensure that the rollers stay perpendicular to the roller on the camshaft. Pay attention to the dog bone in relation to the lifter, because one of the small details when it comes to engine building is when this engine is rotating with a really high lift cam, it will contact that dog bone, and that's one thing that will wreck your valve train. Alright, next on our engine build, we're getting ready to install this spider. This thing is very important as it keeps the lifters straight in the bore. And when doing so, it's important to use a good quality fastener such as this ARP, along with some blue thread locker. I'm finishing up this spider here, and when I get that done, I'm going to put the other cylinder head on there and get it bolted down. Right. One thing about engine building is you want to use a quality fastener. We've used these hex head ARP bolts with really good success. Now they make them in a 12-point head, but the 6-point seems to fit the bill for what we're doing. We've had great repeatability and they'll last forever. Important note, most production engines, the head bolts go into water, and so that's why you have to use a sealant. Now, in order to get good torque specifications, you've got to use this great ARP lube under the head of the bolt between the washers, so that when you put this thing down and you torque it, you know that the foot-pounds are as what it shows.
Here we are going through the torque sequence on the head, starting off at 30 and going right round all the sequence until we reach the required torque, which is, what is it, Andy? 70 foot-pounds?
Yeah.
Right. So with our ARP bolts, we will have about 12,000 pounds clamping that Velcro head gasket.
As I finish up torquing these cylinder heads, I'm going to sort out the valve train.
Terry Walters, team leader, 42 years in the business.
Jack Sane, nearly 40 years experience, engine tuner.
Charlie Savidio, cylinder head porter, 30 years plus cylinder head experience. Today, I'm a dyno assistant.
Alright, the intake we chose for this was the RPM air gap. If you note the slot cut here, this aids in tuning and permits a little extra top end. I have found a lot of the engines, manifolds you buy do not have this milled out. An inexpensive way to do this without taking the manifold off, having it milled, is buy one of these old Ford gaskets. Cut the center out, put it on there, and it gives you the exact same tunability and a little addition to the top end.
Okay, what we have here is a set of E7TE Ford heads reconditioned to stock specs. 1.78 intake, 1.46 exhaust, stock springs, stock retainers, stock locks, and stock rockers.
Here we have the test results of our 302 on Terry Walters dyno at Walters Engines in Roanoke, Virginia. The only modification to the long block is the inclusion of the Jones cam, which was in our short block previously, and it was on the right lobe centerline angle to hit the middle of the road for all the cylinder heads we had to test. Also, since we are testing street heads here, we put a street cam in. This Jones cam was 260 degrees duration, so it's quite a bit shorter than stock. Nonetheless, it managed to make about 45 foot-pounds more torque and about 40 horsepower more than the stock cam. Plus more vacuum and way more torque down here. Basically what it did was it made our 302 drive like it was a 351. Here's the figures. 337.7 foot-pounds of torque and 282 horsepower, right? That is our baseline. We will now test, and that will be in the next issue, we will test the John Rossello head that has been done to my specs to represent a good aftermarket cylinder head. Okay, at this point the head's going to be changed. You need to hit the notify button, the like button, the subscribe button, etc. Why? So that you don't miss part 2 of this video. This is where we'll be testing not only the John Rossello heads, but also the effect of changing the stock rockers with the supposedly same ratio aluminum rockers, just to see what it does to the power output. There'll be a few other things we'll talk about as well, but nonetheless, it's an issue that of PowerTec 10 you do not want to miss. Thank you.